Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of David and Belinda Temple? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. David Mark Temple was born on July 19, 1968, and lived in Katy, Texas. This is about a half hour west of Houston. David was physically larger than most of his classmates in school. He was held back a year in grade school, which only made the disparity greater. David went to Katy High School. He was in the same class as Renee Zellweger, who would later go on to be an Academy Award-winning actress. Playing football as a defensive lineman offered David a way to use his size to his advantage. He was considered a star athlete. He played the game with a high degree of intensity and was known for losing his temper. People who knew David thought of him as a bully. He was condescending, arrogant, grandiose, and believed that he was special. He had big plans for his future. He believed that he was destined to be with a beautiful woman. David intimidated other students, and even a few of the teachers. His tendency to be high sensation-seeking landed David in some trouble. In 1987, he was arrested for breaking into motor vehicles. The police believed that he might have perpetrated between 6 and 8 break-ins. David was offered a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to attempted burglary of a vehicle, a Class A misdemeanor, and was sentenced to 3 days in jail. He graduated from high school 2 months later and attended Stephen F. Austin University. Not surprisingly, football became the primary activity for David. He was considered a good player and was referred to as the Temple of Doom. In college, David became romantically involved with a woman named Belinda Lucas. The couple became engaged in November of 1991 and married shortly after during the winter break. Both David and Belinda studied the same subjects in college. They each graduated with a bachelor's degree in physical education before earning a master's degree in education. The couple moved to Katy, Texas, where David worked at a high school as a teacher and a coach. Belinda worked as a teacher at a different high school. In April 1995, Belinda had a son named Evan. The relationship between David and Belinda disintegrated over the next few years. David became verbally aggressive and insulting. He was unhappy with Belinda's weight gain. In 1998, Belinda became pregnant again. In the fall of that same year, David started having an affair with a woman named Heather Scott. He spent New Year's Eve and New Year's Day with Heather in her townhouse having sex. On January 8, 1999, David said to Heather, "I think I have fallen totally in love with you." Heather responded that she felt the same way about him. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Monday, January 11, 1999, Belinda and David were both at work as usual. Their 3-year-old son, Evan, was at a daycare center. At 11:40 a.m., Belinda was informed by the daycare center that Evan was running a fever of 100.6 degrees. Evan could not remain at the daycare with that temperature. Belinda left work, picked up Evan from the daycare, and arrived home at about 12:30 p.m. She contacted David and asked him to come home to watch Evan so she could return to work for an afternoon meeting. When David arrived home and assumed childcare responsibilities, Belinda left the house and returned to work. When work was over, Belinda returned home, arriving at about 3:45 p.m. 30-year-old Belinda Temple and her unborn child were murdered sometime within the next 2 hours. At 5:38 p.m., David Temple called 911 and said that someone had broken into his house and his wife had been shot. When the police arrived, they found that Belinda Temple had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun blast to the back of her head. Her body was lying face down in the master bedroom closet. Here's the story that David supplied to investigators. Belinda called him to come home to care for Evan. At about 3:45 p.m., Belinda returned home for the last time that day. By this time, Evan was feeling better. David decided to take Evan out of the house so Belinda could rest. He took Evan to a park. When they finished there, they went to a Brookshire Brothers grocery store where David purchased drinks and cat food. After this, David drove to a Home Depot store. With their errands now complete, David and his son returned home. After pulling into the garage, David left his son in the vehicle and walked into the backyard. There he noticed that the back door of the house was open, and a window in that door had been broken. David immediately returned to the garage, grabbed Evan, and went to a neighbor's house across the street. He dropped Evan off with the neighbors while yelling about how his house had been broken into. David ran back across the street to his house as one of the neighbors ran behind him with the intent of offering assistance. After David went into the backyard of his house, the neighbor attempted to follow him, but David's aggressive dog growled and charged at the neighbor. The neighbor stepped back out of the yard and slammed the gate shut right before the dog ran into it. The neighbor was unable to render assistance. David entered the house alone. After walking upstairs, David found Belinda's body in the master bedroom closet. Here's what the police found during their investigation. Video surveillance from the Brookshire Brothers grocery store revealed that David and Evan entered at 4:32 p.m. and exited at 4:38 p.m. As far as the Home Depot visit, David and his son were captured on video there at 5:14 p.m. The two stores were about 12 minutes apart. The police wondered why it took David 36 minutes to make the trip. Investigators found out that David was having an affair with Heather Scott. This gave him a motive to commit murder. In a house not far from David's home, three brothers, ages 6, 8, and 9, thought they heard a gunshot sometime in the afternoon as they were watching the movie Dr. Dolittle. The oldest boy remembered the scene that was playing when he heard the gunshot. Using this, the police were able to calculate the time of the gunshot. They thought it was around 4:30 p.m. David was just about to enter the Brookshire Brothers grocery store at this time. The statements of the three brothers supported the idea that David was not involved with his wife's murder. As far as the physical evidence at the crime scene, the window in the back door had been broken. The house looked as if it had been ransacked, but nothing was stolen. Jewelry and other valuables were in plain view. A TV set had been knocked off a table, but the TV was still plugged in. If an intruder was responsible, the police wondered why they wouldn't unplug the television before moving it. No murder weapon was ever recovered. No physical evidence tied David to the crime. There was another potential suspect who the police looked into. One of Temple's neighbors had a 16-year-old son who went by the name Joe. He had allegedly caused some trouble in the neighborhood. Belinda talked to his parents about Joe skipping school. Initially, Joe lied to the police and said that he was in school all day on January 11, but later admitted he did not go to school and was using marijuana instead. Joe had a history of using his father's 12-gauge shotguns without permission, and his friends had stolen shotguns a few weeks earlier. The police thoroughly investigated both David and Joe and came to believe that Joe was not involved in the murder. They concluded that David must have been the killer. They believed this despite the report by the three brothers about hearing a gunshot at the time when David had an alibi. The case against David Temple was mostly based on the fact that he had an affair and the way the crime scene appeared to be staged. The state did not think they had enough for a conviction. Nothing much happened with the case for the next few years. David Temple and his affair partner Heather Scott married less than 2 years after the murder of his wife, Belinda Temple. It appeared as though David was moving on with his life. On November 12, 2004, the notorious killer Scott Peterson was convicted for the murder of his pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson. This case brought new attention to the idea that a husband could murder his pregnant wife. Inspired by Scott Peterson, the state of Texas decided to pursue charges against David Temple. He was arrested for murder on November 29, 2004. David was surprised when the police told him the reason for his arrest. He whined about how his wife's murder was 6 years ago. In October 2007, David went on trial. The state argued that David had a motive to commit murder in the form of his affair with Heather Scott. The defense argued that David simply didn't have enough time to commit the murder. David Temple was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. In 2016, his conviction was overturned on appeal after the court found that prosecutors withheld critical evidence from the defense. He was released on bond as he waited for a second trial. On July 8, 2019, David went on trial again. 4 days later, his wife Heather Scott announced that she had filed for divorce. On August 6, 2019, David was once again found guilty of murder. Based on the laws which were in effect in 1999, David could have received anywhere from probation to life in prison. The jury could not agree on a sentence, so a mistrial was declared for only the punishment phase. 2 of the jury members did not want David to go to prison for life. The case was delayed for years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On April 21, 2023, David Temple was sentenced to life in prison. Now moving to my analysis. David Temple maintains his innocence, and there are many people who support him. The state, of course, believes that David murdered his wife so he could be with his lover. This brings me to the question, was David Temple guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. David was having an affair when his wife was murdered and declared his love for his affair partner 3 days before the murder. When talking to the police, David tried to act like he wasn't really in love with Heather Scott. He said she didn't mean anything to him. It was just a physical thing, not love. Despite this, David sent a dozen roses to Heather on February 14, 1999, Valentine's Day. This was just over a month after his wife was murdered. In addition, less than 2 years after the murder, David married Heather. The scene of the murder was inconsistent with the behavior of an intruder. The house was ransacked, but nothing was taken. Why would a burglar target a house at around the time people come home from work? And why would they be carrying a shotgun in broad daylight? The position of the broken glass from the window in the back door was peculiar. The door opened to the left as someone was entering the house. The glass was primarily found to the left of the entryway. If the intruder broke the glass to gain entry, it should have been mostly right behind the door, straight into the house. This made it seem as though the glass had been broken when the door was already open. A burglar would not need to break the glass if the door was open. David owned a dog that was extremely aggressive, so much so the dog actually prevented a neighbor from getting into the backyard. When the police arrived, they also had trouble getting in the backyard. They considered shooting the dog. How did the intruder make it into the backyard if the neighbor and the police could not? The neighborhood where the Temple family lived was peaceful, and there wasn't much crime. Belinda was the only person ever murdered in the neighborhood. No one saw David at the park, and a witness spotted him at an intersection, which was not where David said he was. When transporting Evan, David always used Evan's car seat, but he did not use it on the day of the murder. David had enough time to commit the murder before he left the house, and could have staged the scene upon his return. The boys who said they heard a gunshot were not reliable witnesses. Only the oldest boy had information to narrow down the time, and this was based on watching the movie Dr. Dolittle. The boys could have heard anything. It was not necessarily a firearm discharge that they heard. The shotgun used in the murder was never recovered, but David owned 12-gauge shotgun shells and was experienced with 12-gauge shotguns. David's story about leaving the house to allow Belinda to rest doesn't make a lot of sense. Belinda had picked up soup right before coming home for the final time. The soup was not in the refrigerator. Why would she have gone upstairs to rest without taking care of the soup? In addition, Belinda's keys were found on one of the steps leading upstairs. This is not where she left her keys normally. The odd placement of the soup and the keys would have occurred when David was still in the house. A friend asked David why he wasn't cooperating with the investigation. David responded with something like, "What difference is that going to make? It isn't going to bring Belinda back." Moving to the exculpatory factors, no physical evidence tied David to the murder. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no video. A laboratory did find gunshot residue on a jacket owned by David, but it was ruled inadmissible. As far as the glass that was found in the wrong place by the back door of the house, maybe it broke when David pushed the door open quickly. Like when the door stopped suddenly, the glass shattered. The 16-year-old neighbor Joe was a pretty good alternate potential suspect. The shotgun used in the murder was never found. There was no record of David purchasing or otherwise coming into the possession of a shotgun. Neighborhood boys heard the gunshot at around 4:30 p.m. when David had an alibi. David did not initiate the situation that resulted in him caring for Evan as Belinda returned to work. He did not cause his son to have a fever. When considering the evidence, do I think that David was guilty of murder? Yes, I believe he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, although this case represents a close call. Here's what I think happened. This is just a theory, my opinion. David became infatuated with his lover, Heather. She implied that her sexual encounter with David was not memorable. I guess instead of being a temple of doom, David was more like a temple of disappointment. Either way, David felt differently about the sexual encounter. It was something that was amazing and life-changing for him. When David went home at the request of Belinda, they engaged in an argument, and David murdered her. He was motivated by his desire to be with his lover and his anger toward his wife. He tried to assemble an alibi and stage the scene to make it look like an intruder committed the murder, but he forgot about the dog, the soup, and Belinda's keys. This murder occurred because David was impulsive, self-centered, irresponsible, sensation-seeking, arrogant, and had a tremendous sense of entitlement. He was a bully who thought that he could always get his way. Eventually, he found out that he was incorrect. Those are my thoughts on the case of David and Belinda Temple. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.